Hey, what's going on, everybody? So today, actually, I have these notes that I make for myself just to kind of keep track of information or whatnot, and it's about the CIA and its fascinating history in the Cold War era. As a disclaimer, I don't actually hate the CIA. I mean, I have no affiliation with them or anything like that. My belief is that all countries have intelligence agencies that are in the business of dirty tricks. It's just the game. Um, I don't really want to get too much into, or rather, I don't want to come off as a conspiracy theorist. Rather, I'm just fascinated by the history of events of the Central Intelligence Agency and even other agencies, notably during the Cold War era. And there was a lot going on. And if I could briefly describe the history of the CIA in the 20th century, it would basically be its creation after World War II, the kind of glory years of the CIA in which they were kind of doing a good job. And I know I'm not saying it was good that they did this, but they were very successful as an early new agency in overthrowing various regimes such as Iran, excuse me, Guatemala, etc. Right, a lot of the banana republics, etc. Right. However, it seems that from the 1950s to early 60s, before the Bay of Pigs invasion, the CIA kind of, as a new organization, got a little sloppy. And that sloppiness culminated in the Bay of Pigs invasion. And after the Bay of Pigs invasion happened, that was a major milestone for the agency. They still didn't have very much oversight, which didn't really come until the congressional hearings that occurred under CIA Director William Colby, who was kind of like a principal, like a high school principal, trying to kind of get the very wily CIA cowboys under control. Um, and a lot of the revelations of the CIA culminated in the 70s, such as the MK Ultra program that everybody knows about, assassination programs, etc., etc. But in the 1980s, I would say the next big phase was the Iran Contra era, right? And this is the one that really fascinates a lot of people, just because I think of the um, how iconic the 1980s is. There's this kind of sense of clandestine operations with the 1980s because of the, drug dealing, cocaine, arms dealing, cold warriors. Across the globe, there was hotspots going on from South America to Africa to the Middle East to Pakistan to Southeast Asia, still from the leftovers from the Vietnam War era, which was notable for drug trafficking, etc. But regardless, before I go further, is that I love the United States of America. I think it's okay to criticize your country and also still love your country. Everything that I'm finding is public, so I'm not like digging into like crazy things I don't have access to or anything. This is just public information. Um, and yeah, so I'm just gonna kind of take it from here. So this is one of the sketches that I did. This is about Iran Contra, right? So just quickly summarize this as quickly as I can. Iran Contra was the right wing Contras, counter revolutionaries, versus the left wing communist Sandinistas, right? Um, and Ronald Reagan did not want communism spreading. So he wanted to take an aggressive approach to Nicaragua, where the events were happening. However, Congress was wary of another Vietnam, also wary in arming all these revolutions across the world. So they passed the Boland Amendment, which forbade direct sales or sales of munitions to the Contras, right? So this kind of foiled Ronald Reagan's policy of, fighting communism, because he was a proponent of the earlier created domino doctrine, which of course is if communism spreads to one country, is gonna go to another and another and another, right? Which was largely the impetus behind even the Vietnam War. Um, but regardless, Ronald Reagan, he has a National Security Council like every president does. There was four notable people on that council, which who were Bud McFarlane, Casper Weinberger, uh, Donald Reagan, George Shultz, right? So there's a really good video. I think his name is Sean Munger, who does a really good video, historical, totally non-biased approach, very historical, objective analysis, rehash of the Iran Contra situation. And I highly recommend you give him a shout out and a like, a subscription even, and watch that video. I will put the link to his video within this video. Um, but regardless, so you had essentially Ronald Reagan's National Security Council, right? But Bud McFarlane gets an idea, right? He gets an idea from an Israeli named David Kimchi to use Iran-born dealer Munasher uh, Gorbanifer to help sell arms to Iran for hostages, right? So we have to realize, right, in the late 70s, from I think from Gerald Ford to Carter to early Reagan, there was a lot of kidnappings of Americans happening in the Middle East. We all know about the Iranian embassy crisis, which inspired movies such as the movie Argo with Ben Affleck. But there was also, other terror groups in the region, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, who were kidnapping people. So there was so America had a hostage crisis or in the late 70s, early 80s. And it was largely perceived that Jimmy Carter was weak and ineffective in dealing with it. Um, and for example, one of the reasons why the Iranian American embassy was taken over by followers of the Ayatollah was because of Jimmy Carter's relationship with the Shah of Iran, in which the Shah of Iran was diagnosed with a form of cancer, and Carter gave the Shah access to the United States to get cancer treatment. And this largely angered the Iranian people, who saw the Shah as an as an oppressive person. So that was one of the many reasons why I would probably say that the American embassy in Tehran was invaded, right? Um, but there were just other things going on too. America's support for Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But regardless, right? So Ronald Reagan beats Carter, and he needs to figure out this hostage situation, right? How can he do this though? What can he give the Iranians to help them free U.S. hostages, right? So this is where the Bud McFarlane, David Kimchi idea comes in, right? So this Israeli guy, David Kimchi, gets with Bud McFarlane, says, "Hey, let's use this arms dealer or Gorbanifer or Gobanifar to help sell arms to Iran in exchange for them releasing hostages." But the USA can't actually sell them arms directly, so they have to go through an intermediary, and that intermediary was Israel. And I want to believe that the flow of arms actually came, I think, from the USA to Portugal, then from Portugal to Israel, then from Israel to Iran, if I'm correct. Um, but regardless, right? So there was another player, Admiral John Poindexter, and his subordinate, Oliver North, who was a U.S. Marine who was tied to the National Security Agency, the NSA, right? So Oliver North was kind of like the project manager of getting this whole operation going, right, on behalf of um, Ronald Reagan, right? So remember, right? So Reagan has two big issues, right? He wants to arm the Contras, but he also wants to release the Iranian hostages, right? So he tries to kill multiple birds with one stone. You can even add a third element in that not only does he want to free American hostages from Iran or Iranian proxies such as Hezbollah, or allies like the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Army, or whatever. Um, he also wants to pit potentially Iraq against Iran by giving Iran weapons to potentially check Saddam Hussein, who was still kind of an ally to the United States, but it seems that the United States, and this is just maybe me just speculating myself, likes to kind of keep people like that in power in check to a certain extent. Like in other words, making sure they don't get too big for their britches so they become uncontrollable or hamper global markets, which Saddam Hussein eventually did when he invaded Kuwait. Um, but regardless, Oliver North was assigned to be like the program manager of this operation, right? So he ends up working with a guy named Richard Secord. Richard Secord, for people who are very aware of CIA lore, was a U.S. Air Force pilot who was very involved in Southeast Asia, Air America, things of that nature, right? So he was very known for like smuggling things, right? Flying arms from where they needed to go, right? So how it worked was Richard Secord would actually fly the arms to Iran, or I think to Israel, and Israel would give it to Iran. The proceeds from that would go into Swiss bank accounts. So Oliver North would put money into a Swiss bank account to facilitate the actual purchase of the munitions, which I want to believe was like around 500 Tau missiles. And also, so that's the money from that, and then they would use that money to procure Tau missiles, and then Richard Secord, I think via Portugal or Israel or whatnot, would actually transfer them to Iran, get money, but Oliver North realized he actually made profit on the deal. So he took that profit and decided to invest that into the Contras. So it was kind of like a hostages, arms for hostages deal in which the profit was therefore diverted to the Contras in order to bypass Congress, right? So, in other words, they were using illicit and unapproved congressional arms shipments and the profits to fund a clandestine war in Latin America, right? But it eventually evolved from guns into drugs because where is Nicaragua at? Right at the crux between Venezuela, Mexico, the Caribbean, Cuba, Miami, etc., Panama, etc., right? In both sides, arguably, the Contras and the Sandinistas were largely benefiting from the cocaine industry, right? Um, anyways, so that's kind of like that's why I have these all labeled number one for Admiral Poindexter, Oliver North, Richard Secord, etc., right? So that was like the first thing, right? But then there was a plot number two, and plot number two is oops, excuse my actually oops, let me go back here real quick. Okay, here we go. All right, sorry about that. So go back here, go back here. All right, so there's a plot number two, right? So McFarlane steps down, and John Poindexter. So for whatever reason, I didn't finish that sentence, like my notes there or whatever. But McFarlane steps down, and I want to say maybe John Poindexter steps in for him. But North, therefore, you can almost say kind of getting a promotion in a sense, drafts an elaborate plan to Poindexter called Operation Recovery to sell an additional 3,000 missiles, like Hawk missiles, to Iran. But North's proposal had flawed information from Gorbaniffer, and I think some sort of CIA forgery or whatnot, right? And this is all explained in Sam Munger's video. But regardless, so North also realized he could get CIA to buy missiles at profit from the DoD. So they're shuffling munitions from the CIA to the DoD, making profit in through intra agency sales. But then they're also diverting these funds without congressional oversight to arms dealers like this Gorbanifer person who's working with Israel to sell it to Iran. And however, if we go down, this Gorbanifer, um, in order to help him facilitate the sales, he got a bridge loan from Adnan Khashoggi, who is the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi. And Jamal Khashoggi is actually the cousin to Dodi Fayed, the boyfriend of Princess Diana. So that's just a random fact, right? But this is why I put that in there, is because this even kind of oddly connects to Jeffrey Epstein, because Jeffrey Epstein was a player in the 1980s as an arms trafficker who has weird ties to like Eritrea or Djibouti or something like that. Illicit diamond sales. So, like, in other words, kind of like a money launderer who, an arms dealer in a sense, who evolved into what it appears to be, or what he was arrested for. Arguably, what he actually did was human sex trafficking and possibly sexual incrimination entrapment practices, right? So the Epstein stuff, interestingly to me, is actually um, a flashback to what was actually going on in the deep state of the 1980s. And I've written about this before and I've talked about this before, is that Epstein was kind of like the final, how can I put it into words? Epstein was kind of like the culmination of the cleanup operation of the 1980s. In other words, Donald Trump coming into power, right? You have, was it William Barr? William Barr was an operative within the Reagan White House and everything, right? Um, it's my personal opinion that there was a cleanup operation in order to prevent the inevitable truth from coming out, and Epstein had to go. But Epstein going, interestingly, kind of opened a Pandora's box into the past, in which you can actually see, Iran Contra and even other larger CIA intrigues of old, and kind of how the world works, really. Um, I have a personal thesis called the ACZS Network, and that stands for the Anglo American Continental Zionist Thought Network. And that is essentially the people who control the West. So Anglo Americans, you have the Americans and the British and the Commonwealth countries, right? Five Eye Partners, the UK USA Treaty, things of that nature, right? The Anglos, right? Protestant, predominantly white, the blue bloods of the Ivy League, but then also your Oxford, Cambridge, kind of MI5, 6, or whatever type people. Then you also have the Continentals, who basically represent continental Europe, who are typically kind of a division between Catholic and Protestant orientation, highly involved in banking, such as Swiss banking, Luxembourg banking, Liechtenstein banking, Vatican banking, typically tied to like the Catholic Church and its various military and charitable orders, which can actually be very useful in regards to clandestine operations, in which these Catholic organizations have ties, of course, across the globe. You almost say that the papacy was the original intelligence service. Um, but there's also a very strong tie between American Catholicism with groups like Opus Dei, the Knights of Columbus, but then you also have the Knights of Malta back in Europe. But the Continentals effectively represent NATO. Um, and then you have the Zionists, who are, of course, the Israeli Jews, and also just global Jews across the globe. but not necessarily ethnic or religious Jews, but also Zionist in a religious sense, which can also rub off and create correlation with the Anglo Americans, such as the evangelical Christian community in the United States, the British Israelism movement, manifest destiny type things, the British Empire and the Americas, etc. But then you also have the Sods, and the Sods are effectively the oil. Who they control oil, or effectively, right? The largest, biggest player, really, as far as controlling oil markets, right? They're the gas station of the world. So that nexus between the ACZS network, is what I call it, those are the people who control the world, and the Epstein death, even possibly even the Princess Diana death, a lot of the Iran Contra stuff, the Banco de Ambrosiano scandal, the BCCI bank scandal, the Nugan Hand Bank scandal, drug trafficking in the Golden Triangle. Um, uh, I mean, it goes on and on. A lot of these things are all interwoven, um, as you go back in time, right? But Iran Contra, interestingly, is like probably the most fascinating, most recent story that kind of connects what I personally believe to be the still existing Iran Contra deep state under Donald Trump, with people like Michael Flynn, who has connections to people like General John Singlaub, who was the general and CIA asset who was basically managing a lot of these covert shadow wars, is still in existence. I think a lot of people want to believe that Donald Trump is going to clean up the deep state, but my argument is that Donald Trump is the deep state. He's just a symbolic mascot for a faction of the deep state. The deep state is kind of not corny, but almost a very misleading term. And I think a lot of bias has kind of tricked the American people into thinking that the deep state is somehow a left wing liberal institution, which is comical to me, and not inherently a right wing organization apparatus that basically exists to protect capital and the rights of the capitalist class, who by nature, by design, are more right wing, right? Because that's how they make money. They make money by not liking unions, not liking minimum wages, not liking regulations, right? Not liking any hindrance to profit. But regardless, right? Back to this stuff. But all right, Contra, right? So McFarland and North actually go to Iran, right? Hoping to meet Ali Rafsanjani, who was the speaker of the Iranian legislature, and Ali Khomeini, who was the president. But both of these men were no-shows, and Ghorbanifar played both sides and was later found out to have overcharged the Iranians on spare parts. So this Ghorbanifar guy was actually a very slick person, right? But who introduced the Americans to Ghorbanifar? The Israelis, which kind of goes to show, in my personal opinion, when it comes to what I consider to be the ACZS network, is that even though these kind of camps, gangs, mafia families are in cahoots with each other, they still double cross and dirty dog each other all the time. For various reasons. It's a constant game of chess and incrimination, and I know this about you and you know this about me. Let's deal, let's work, yada yada, right? Keeping things cold, dirty, dark, damp, and in the shadows, so they don't boil up to the surface and become hot and kinetic conflicts. Um, so, anyways, right? So, so there's that. So then, regardless, the proceeds are still being washed through Swiss banks, and the money, eventually, some of that money, of course, finds its way to the Contras, or the FDN, which is just Spanish for the Nicaraguan Democratic Front, right? However, there's a character, right? You don't really hear a lot about in Iran Contra. Actually, you don't really hear even about John K. Singlaub all that much in Iran Contra, even though he was a major player. But there was a person named John Hull, and John Hull was arguably a CIA asset who was a cattle rancher in Costa Rica on the border with the border nearing the border of Nicaragua. And I think he had something crazy like anywhere between 3,000 to 8,000 acres of land, which was basically a base, a clandestine base that the CIA was able to use and fly, you know, their planes into to basically unload arms purchased through the illicit funds generated by Oliver North, but also the private financing and fundraising of John K. Singlaub through his organization called the Western Goals Foundation. Those guns are going to the Contras. And John K. Singlaub is kind of like the clandestine general overseeing things and making sure they're trained correctly, right? But not only are they shipping in guns, many people involved in this who were arrested actually and were cooperating with investigators said that the Contras were also loading cocaine into those very same planes and shipping them to the United States because, of course, you can make illicit slush funds from those proceeds to continue operating your shadow war, right? And the sad thing though is, of course, is this is why crack cocaine became a big thing in the United States, right? Because it got out of control. When the DEA, ATF, FBI, CIA are supposed to be fighting these guys, but they're kind of giving them a pass, in order to achieve higher level American objectives, what have you. The American people become affected by these things, right? They become byproducts of it, and eventually cocaine becomes freebasing, and freebasing becomes crack. And then this is all during the 1980s, where there's STD pandemics that Ronald Reagan did not address. So the 1980s was kind of this very wild, rogue, clandestine party, live for today, not tomorrow, sort of era, right? All largely because of the Central Intelligence Agency trying to win the Cold War um, through clandestine means, rather than through diplomacy, democracy, visibility, etc. So John Hull's farm is a character. John Hull is a guy I want to also talk about, right? But then also I think this is where you also start getting into the Barry Seal kind of drug smuggling lore, the Mena, Arkansas, in the Boys on the Track lore. In other words, there was like two teenage boys in Mena, Arkansas, who most likely discovered illegal drug transaction and were actually killed by local law enforcement who were corrupt. But Barry Seal, even though there's not necessarily a connection between the Boys on the Track and Barry Seal, because of his deep roots with the CIA, Air America, and drug smuggling, it's kind of hard to think that these two things aren't related. But then you also get the character Oscar Danilo Blandon, who was the supplier to Free Ray Ricky Ross, and Free Ray Ricky Ross was basically giving cocaine or selling cocaine in Los Angeles and across the country, but notably to the Bloods and the Crips, and therefore a lot of that crazy red versus blue gang violence that started in Los Angeles but eventually crept up to the Bay Area and even Portland, Oregon, and even Tacoma, Hilltop in the Central District in Seattle, and across the country started spilling over. And you got to think about it, right? You have street kids from bad neighborhoods, horrible neighborhoods, selling drugs. That money is likely confiscated by authorities. The ATF, DEA steps in, confiscates that money, but then that money is most likely being diverted by the CIA to the Contras and keeping the cycle perpetually going. while you're simultaneously incarcerating minority people, right? So it's like not only is like the deep state getting its racism fill, it's also destroying and polluting the poorer classes of the United States, while also funding the military complex and also creating kind of destabilization against communism globally, right? And you got to think that this is like a right wing person's wet dream, which is why it's laughable to me that people nowadays want to insinuate that like the deep state is somehow a liberal, blue-haired social justice warrior feminist organization or something, right? Because a lot of the veterans from these eras are now the older policymakers. Now they're veterans at the Council of Foreign Relations and things of that nature. So John K. Singlaub, right, who's training the Contras, um, let me see here. He also has ties to an Australian bank named Nugan Hand Bank. And the Nugan Hand Bank is very interesting because Oliver North also has ties to it. And the Nugan Hand Bank was a bank in Australia founded by an ex Green Beret named Michael Hand and also an Australian businessman, I think Mike Nugan, and they created this bank in the but everybody who was like the advisor or on the board of the bank were either ex-military or ex-CIA, and even um, William Colby, the CIA director in the 1970s, was even connected to the bank. So shadow banks play a major role in cleaning, washing, and moving money during the Cold War to fund these clandestine operations. From trying to fight back communism in Angola or Mozambique, um, propping up the Rhodesian regime and everything like that, and the South Africans. I mean, the list goes on. So I just wanted to show you that right there. Um, yeah, so that's kind of basically, like I said, the Sean Munger video is really good. But one of the reasons why I also wanted to show you this is because the Nugan Hand Bank connects, right? And the Nugan Hand Bank can be found in what I call something that I've been working on called the Blonde Ghost Network. So sorry, let this buffer real quick. Okay, so Iran Contra even connects to what I call the Blonde Ghost Network, right? This is something that I kind of created and I was working on based on just notes of videos and reading and old archive videos, right? And it sounds goofy, but the Blonde Ghost Network, I named it that because of a person named Theodore Shackley, who was nicknamed the Blonde Ghost, who was a higher up in the CIA, who kind of seems to have ran his own private kind of, you can say, like department within the CIA, and he was involved in arms dealing, training assassins. I mean, all sorts of crazy, wild stuff. Phoenix program. It goes on, right? But the Nugan Hand Bank actually connects to Iran Contra, and I'll start another video to kind of go into more of the details here because it gets crazy. Like we can literally go from we talked about Iran Contra, right? We can go from Iran Contra to Noriega to the cartels. Um, Let me see here in Latin America. There's even ties to the Banco de Ambrosiano with Roberto Calvi. There's the Bolivia cocaine coup with neo Nazis and Nazis like Klaus Barbie. And I'm pretty sure the CIA knew a lot of these Nazi war criminals were still in existence, and in many cases, just probably treated some of these ex-Nazis, and who many of them went into arms dealing and private military companies. They were just one of the many people that the CIA could call on to take care of the dirty business, right? So we got Iran Contra, Latin America. Then that even connects to what something called Operation TikToks, which actually deals with veterans of the Bay of Pigs dealing with cocaine trafficking. And some of those Bay of Pigs veterans actually were actually used by the CIA to fight in Congo, who were led by Rip Robertson, who was also an alumni of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then that even connects to William Colby, Southeast Asia, Air America, all the various airline companies that the CIA had. That connects to the Golden Triangle, and then that connects to back up to the Blonde Ghost Network with Theodore Shackley and figures like Edwin Wilson, who was actually arrested for trying to sell C4 explosives to the Gaddafi regime. And Edwin Wilson actually, through intermediaries with a person named Patry E. Loomis, um, actually recruited Green Berets from Fort Hood, I think. I think it's like Camp Freedom or something now, but from North Carolina to basically go to Libya to basically help train Gaddafi's forces. So you start realizing that the CIA, they're also working with the enemy. And you can say that they're in, but why would they do that? And you can make the argument that they're doing it because they just want to get as much information as they possibly can. They want to burrow. They want to get moles in there. They want to be able to track their arms shipments across the globe and everything like that, right? In other words, they create chaos to control the chaos in an effect, right? Um, but it's wild. And there was another character within the Blonde Ghost network under Ted Shackley, and I call them the enforcers. I call these guys the enforcers. So you had Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, Gregory Corcala, and to a looser extent, Kevin P. Mulcahy, who was actually kind of a sad case. I think he was actually kind of a good guy, and I think he like drove himself insane into alcoholism when he kind of discovered what people like Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson were doing. Um, but people like Frank Turple, who actually has his own documentary, I think it's like Confessions of Frank Turple or something like that. Frank Turple had connections to, I mean, it's wild. The Grey Wolves, who are like a right wing fascist group out of Turkey, who were associated with Operation Gladio. And that's actually where the term the deep state comes from. There was actually a big scandal in which like the head of like Turkish military, like a senator and an interesting individual named Abdullah Katlai, who was actually an assassin and drug and heroin smuggler associated with the Grey Wolves, were actually all killed in a car crash in Turkey. And the fact that it would be like George Bush being in the same car as Pablo Escobar and them getting into a car accident, you know. And this revealed that there was a deep state, and that term, the deep state, was taken by other academics and scholars, and it became kind of part of our modern lexicon. Um, but this Frank Turple guy, he had ties to Mehmet Akka, who actually shot the Pope, John Paul II. He had ties to the Somosas. And I want to say his Somosas were like the dictator family of Nicaragua or Guatemala or whatnot. I want to say Nicaragua. He also had ties to Bokassa, Yugoslavia, Iran, Iraq, but also to most likely Italian neo-fascist terrorists like Stefano del Chiai, also known as the Black Prince, who is known for his bombings during the Year of Lead, in which the Year of Lead is noted and documented as having CIA involvement, in which you had left wing organizations using terror against right wing and right wing against left wing, etc., etc. But but the Italian Years of Lead thing, of course, deals with another big thing in the CIA clandestine lore, of the P2 Masonic Lodge, right? Which is essentially a Masonic lodge of Italian elites and even royalty who are basically running a shadow government in Italy who had ties to the Central Intelligence Agency, largely with an infrastructure created by ex-CIA spy master James Jesus Angleton, who was kind of like this very paranoid, he thought communists were everywhere spy master, and he was arguably a fascist himself because he had an affinity for Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was one of, these poets in the early 20th century who was associated with people like T.S. Eliot and everything like that. And this is kind of going off track a little bit, but Ezra Pound became a fascist and a sympathizer of Hitler and Mussolini, which just is very disturbing when the chief person ahead of counterintelligence at the CIA is basically a fan of a guy who has an affinity for Hitler, which goes to show how right wing the CIA was at the time, particularly with the cross juncture of Operation Gladio, in which Operation Gladio, set up by people like William Colby and James Jesus Angleton and Frank Wisner, other CIA people, it just goes to show that the Operation Gladio actually had many neo-Nazi, far-right nationalist organizations that they were propping up. You know what I'm saying? It would be like it's like the FBI giving arms and guns to, like, the Michigan militia or something. But then they say that the Michigan militia ends up like trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan or whatever, right? Like, this is like the blowback that was actually happening during the Cold War. But regardless, Iran Contra connects to the Nugan Hand Bank, and I'll just go more into this in a separate video. But it's just pretty fascinating. So thank you, and I'm just gonna end this video right now. So note to self: this is essentially just a summary of the Iran Contra situation. It kind of just to explain that whole thing there. All right. Well, thank you, and take care. All right. Peace.